Hi, and thanks for joining us for this Super Tuesday special here on Fox Local. I'm Kelsey Carlson.
And I'm Amy Hockert. Coming up, we'll have live reports from both here in Minnesota and also from New York for a national snapshot on what we can expect tonight. Political science professor David Schultz will join our Tim Blotz for some more insight as well.
Results will come in tonight from 16 states, and of course that includes Minnesota. Our Rob Olson will join us in a bit for more on the voter turnout across the state. Remember, polls here are still open for another 4 hours. So let's start with what's at stake.
Yeah, so let's begin with the Republicans. More than 1,200 delegates are needed to secure that nomination, and 36% of those delegates are up for grabs tonight. Former President Donald Trump holding an early lead, and he has been dominating up until the past weekend when Nikki Haley actually won her first contest in the District of Columbia. Haley, of course, lost in her home state of South Carolina, but she has vowed to stay in this race through at least today. And David Schultz will have more on what needs to happen for her to stay competitive. As for Donald Trump, polls show that he could win most of the states tonight, if not all of them. Even if he does, though, he couldn't clinch tonight mathematically, but he would come awfully close.
President Joe Biden has 206 delegates after winning all but 2 delegates in South Carolina, Nevada, and Michigan. Of course, Congressman Dean Phillips is challenging Biden but has not won any delegates so far. The 2 delegates Biden didn't win are from Michigan, where there were some uncommitted votes. This has to do with a movement against Biden's support of Israel in the conflict in the Middle East. Activists are pushing a similar movement here, so if there is anything to watch tonight, it could be that. However, it likely won't have an impact on him clinching the nomination. Polls here in Minnesota are open until 8 p.m., and there is still time.
Yeah, and voter turnout really will be one of the storylines tonight, or perhaps a lack of voters heading to the polls. We have our Rob Olson live in Bloomington this afternoon. So, Rob, you've been at a few polling places, and as we all know, one thing working against turnout today is the perception that these races have already been decided.
Yeah, that's a big thing. You know, here in Bloomington, been a couple of polling places here. This one, St. Stephen's Church. When we were here earlier around 1 o'clock or so, they'd had, it was under 100 people, I believe, at that point in time. They said when they opened at 7, between 7 and 8, they had 6 voters in that first hour. Went to another one, a larger polling place here in Bloomington, at St. Michael's Lutheran Church. So there's more voters there. We certainly saw more traffic going in and out of there by about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So an hour and a half ago. They were up to 170 some by that point. Again, a slow trickle in there. Talked to a few voters here who said that, it's not busy at all. And they do get the sense from others that they're not showing up because this is a done deal of a rematch between President Biden and former President Trump. But the couple that I talked to said that not only do they feel that it's important to express your right to vote. This is a very important right to have and to go do, even if you think it's a done deal. But they also had other reasons for doing so, too. A Republican voter who expressed deep dissatisfaction with former President Trump, the policies he liked, the personality he didn't, and was still hoping that Nikki Haley had an outside chance of winning the GOP nomination, thinking that Nikki Haley has a good shot in Minnesota of picking up some delegates, although she remains far behind former President Trump in that nomination race at this point. But that was his motivation. He's also very dissatisfied with President Biden, but is convinced that President Biden won't be on the ballot come November, that Democratic leadership at some point in some fashion will replace him with somebody. Dean Phillips was another question here. This is part of Dean Phillips' district. Also very much a long shot in this, if not an afterthought for a lot of voters, but also still kind of in the back of mind of some voters as well. There's also another thing, another phenomenon that you may see by the end of the night here in Minnesota, and that is the uncommitted voters. And now we saw this in Michigan, where 100,000 people voted uncommitted, is a way to put pressure on President Biden to take more of a stand on the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and to put more pressure on Israel to stop bombing in Gaza. So a lot of uncommitted voters. There's been a big push in Minnesota for a similar uncommitted voting bloc here today in this primary to send that similar message. I talked to one voter who had just voted uncommitted. And he didn't say it was about Israel and Gaza specifically or an anti-Biden vote in his case. He's a young voter who said, in his terms, this is a way to express a dissatisfaction with the same old, and seeing a rematch between Biden and Trump, a dissatisfaction with having to have these choices again, and that there needs to be new voices, new representation, new options on the ballot. And he hoped there would be a significant number of uncommitted votes by the end of the day that would send that message that it is time for new elements in these presidential races. So it'll be interesting to see what those numbers are. 885,000 voted 4 years ago in the primary. That was just over 20% of registered voters in Minnesota. Other states have been having very low turnout. At the end of the day, it'd be interesting to see what that turnout number is and how many people have voted for something other than the two presumptive nominees in this presidential year. Live in Bloomington, Rob Olson, Fox 9.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, we want to ask you just a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind. Just piggybacking off what you said about that young voter you spoke with and why he was uncommitted when he went to the polls. You know, as you know, Minnesota, one of the states where you can show up day of and register to vote for any party. So we want to let people know that as they're thinking about maybe going to vote for the rest of the evening. Can you walk us through that? And then also absentee votes, I understand if you didn't get a chance to mail them in, you can still have your vote count today.
Yeah, I don't. I have not looked into what the absentee voting process is for this primary, so I can't really speak to the specifics of that one. I've just been focused on turnout issues here. But yes, you can register to vote at the polls. That has been a long-standing principle here in Minnesota. And essentially what that means is, there's been a lot of concern about that, obviously, with voter ID pushes, et cetera, about being able to register day of rather than pre-register. But in essence, what you're doing when you register to vote at a polling place is you are registering to vote. Your ballot is basically treated like a mail-in or an absentee ballot at that point. Your registration goes through, and then those ballots are then counted. So it's not that they're just letting you go through. You still are going through the registration process. You can just do that day of, and then your vote is counted once that registration is confirmed. So certainly that is still something that people can do. It'll be interesting to see, obviously, after working hours, what obviously is when things pick up. Now, we came out to a couple places over the lunch hour thinking that that might be a surge, and it was still really just a slow trickle of voters. So be interesting to see again at the end of the day how many people decided that this was still something that they wanted to express their votes, and exactly what sort of vote they wanted to express, whether it was a confirmation of who we presume to be the nominees here, or whether it is expressing an opinion that no, we want to see something different this time around rather than the same choices again.
You know, Rob, you have covered many a Super Tuesday, and traditionally Minnesota, of all the contests on Super Tuesday, has the highest voter turnout. Something like 78% is typical. I know it's not slow everywhere. I saw in Texas today they have some lines that are 20 to 50 minutes long, but just curious because you've covered many a presidential campaign, and as you walked up to the polls today, just your thoughts compared to Super Tuesdays of the past.
Well, what's different, and obviously, before 4 years ago, we had caucuses too, so that was an entirely different process. But you still saw, as caucuses go, a fairly decent amount of people participating in that. And for Super Tuesday, primary days, well, what we're used to as well is having crews at a number of different locations for the primary, because there's still a number of different candidates all in the horse race vying for the nomination. 4 years ago, obviously for the Democratic nomination, I was at a Bernie Sanders party, and there was a Joe Biden party, and there were several other candidates who were still viable candidates racing for the nomination at that point. Unlike today, you go to a polling place 4 years ago for this primary day, and you might, by the end of the day, again when it picks up, you might see a line forming. You certainly see more people showing up, maybe waiting in line to get their ballot. And, we haven't seen that today. You need to go back in and check here at this polling place in Bloomington to see how much that has changed. But certainly the traffic we've seen going in and out is not what we're used to seeing. So, again, this is a very, very different primary day so far. And it'll be interesting to pour through those numbers at the end of the day to see exactly how this turned out and why people who turned out to vote did so.
Rob, we want to let you go. I just want to clarify because I didn't know the answer to this either, and I had to look it up. If you didn't get a chance to mail in your absentee ballot, go ahead and go in and vote today. As soon as you do, that absentee will be canceled. So I had to look that one up too as well. Great job out there, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And, Minnesota is one of the 15 states where voters will head to the polls today, of course. We will also learn results from Iowa's Democratic caucuses, which were done by mail. That deadline's today. Democrats will also hold caucuses in American Samoa today as well. And for more on what to expect tonight and across the country, Fox's Connor Hansen has more from New York.
From Alaska to Maine, millions of voters are casting ballots with topics like immigration and the economy at the top of their minds.
I voted for Donald Trump.
I voted for Nikki Haley.
I'll be voting for Joe Biden, like I did 4 years ago.
Donald Trump is expected to pick up hundreds of delegates, getting him closer to clinching the GOP nomination. The former president is making it clear he believes the race is all but decided.
We're going to have a unified party because our real opponent happens to be named Biden.
Trump says his GOP rival, Nikki Haley, has no path forward. But Haley has continued her campaign, insisting voters need a choice.
We went to 10 states in the last 5 days, and thousands of people showed up because they want to see something positive.
President Biden is not facing much competition, but there is a push by progressive activists to vote uncommitted to protest his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Biden was asked about his recent struggles in the polls.
My poll numbers, the last 5 polls you guys don't report, I'm winning 5 in a row.
Pollsters are already predicting a repeat of 2020.
I'm expecting Trump versus Biden after Super Tuesday. Things are not looking good for Nikki Haley.
And that was Connor Hansen reporting from New York tonight. Well, we're taking a look at all of these issues as we head into the early evening hours. And of course, we'll be starting to get results by the time our 6 o'clock news rolls around.
Yeah, a lot of eyes on this. So scoreboard watchers might think these races are over. Still, though, plenty of unanswered questions.
Among them, what will it take for Haley to stay in this race past tonight? And if Trump does clinch the nominations, what role will his legal issues play in all of this? We turn now to Tim Blatz, who is our political expert, and he has political science professor David Schultz as well.
Well, this is the only race on the Minnesota ballot today, the presidential primary, but this is still really a big day. State lawmakers, along with the DFL and Minnesota Republican parties, purposely moved the primary to Super Tuesday so Minnesota voters could have more of an influence in deciding the eventual major party nominees. Joining us now to learn more about this process is Hamline political science professor David Schultz. And David, I think a good place to start here is reminding people that what they're really voting for today is a proportion of the delegates that these candidates will take in the national conventions, right?
You're absolutely correct, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the national conventions later this year that are going to select eventually for both the Democratic and Republican parties who their party nominees are. And what voters are doing in Minnesota and across the country today, they are casting ballots to help select those delegates who will eventually go to the national convention, who on the first ballot are committed to voting for the way that the people said they should vote, let's say in the state of Minnesota. So it's important. So if you want to have a say, you have to show up. Because if you don't show up, you don't have a say.
Yeah, let's go back to 4 years ago now in the presidential primary here in Minnesota on the Republican ballot. So let's look at the Republican ballot. Donald Trump won 97% of the votes 4 years ago. This year he's got a little competition in Nikki Haley. She campaigned here in Minnesota last week, took the D.C. Primary this past weekend. Does she come in with a little momentum here, David?
She has a little bit, but still at this point, she's got very few delegates. You know, Minnesota may be a state that she has a possibility in terms of doing well in, but you pointed out Trump 97%, 4 years ago, but of course he was the incumbent president. I think Nikki Haley has an incredible long shot here and across the country. And even if she does well here, as you pointed out, there are, 15 other states that are still at stake at this point. I think the real question becomes for her, what happens after today? If the polls are to be believed, if the predictions are to be believed, she's not going to walk away with a lot of delegates right now. And Trump is going to be in a very good position in terms of not winning the nomination, but getting a lot closer. So I think that's where we're going to be tomorrow in terms of Nikki Haley. What's her next move? Does she keep staying in and hoping that something else change? How does the money situation play out? We're already seeing signs that in places like Virginia, Utah, and Vermont, she's been not running ads, suggesting that maybe the money's already running out at this point. Again, indicating perhaps she's starting to wind her campaign down.
Well, at the end of the day, it is all about money and the backers
Yes.
that are coming in and supporting you. And oftentimes it's not because of a lack of desire of these candidates to want to keep going, but it's because the money dries up. It's just simply not there. So at one point, how strong does she have to perform tonight, not just in Minnesota, but in the other 15 states, in order for those donors to keep saying, you know what, we still believe in you, Nikki?
Yeah, I think it's not, she can't go in 15 states and let's say lose 60-40 in all of those states. I think she has to win some states. She has to walk away, I think, at 3 or 4 or maybe 5 of the states where she actually wins at this point. Because if she's still continuously coming in, let's say 60-40, 20 points behind Trump at this point, that's probably not enough to keep her going. She has to show victory. And Washington, D.C. helped her just a small little bump, but I think she has to win several of the states. Minnesota becomes one of those possibilities. There are a few other states out there in terms of maybe she's got a chance in places like California, but she has to show real substantive victories at this point.
David, is part of the calculus here staying in the race so that she becomes a viable alternative in case down the road that there is a conviction against Donald Trump? Because a lot of polling shows that people are with him right now, but they may change their mind if there's a conviction.
See, I think that's her longer game strategy at this point, is that if in fact there is a conviction between now and the Republican National Convention, she wants to be the person that says, I am the alternative. Not somebody like DeSantis or Ramaswamy or anybody else, but I want to be the person who's going to be there. And so I think what she has to do is to keep hanging in as long as possible, showing viability. What's really important to point out here also, and I know Nikki Haley has made this argument, is that if you look at head-to-head polls nationwide, she beats Joe Biden by about 10 percentage points. Now, remember, the presidential election is not popular vote. It's the Electoral College.
Right.
But the popular vote gives us some indication that she is a stronger candidate against Joe Biden than Donald Trump is. And so that's her strategy. It's the long haul strategy in terms of playing this out and hoping that if she can prevent Trump from either getting enough delegates to win it on the first round or look good enough. Again, the polls are suggesting that even, let's say, some of the Trump supporters are willing to say a criminal conviction, yeah, I might change my mind about my support for Trump.
All right, let's talk about Joe Biden and the Democratic side of the ballot here today, because 4 years ago, Joe Biden picked up 38% of the vote in Minnesota. Bernie Sanders got 30%. This year, of course, the ballot is different. There are still 9 candidates on the Democratic ballot today, one of them Dean Phillips. How much of a factor is Dean Phillips anymore?
I don't think Dean Phillips is really much of a factor anymore either. Even though this is his home state, he's been coming in on the primary so far at about 1 to 2%. He had one decent showing out there, I think back in New Hampshire, where he did reasonably well. But at the end of the day, he's really far behind. And in the state of Minnesota, which you think he would do really well, he's burned an incredible number of bridges in terms of his criticism of not just Biden, but of Governor Walz, of Senator Klobuchar. I expect in a primary like this, where it's the hardcore party faithful who are going to come out, he's not going to do very well today. And he's got the same issue in terms of Nikki Haley. What's his path? Where does he go after today? And unless somehow Dean Phillips thinks that he also can run this long haul strategy and he becomes the alternative, I don't see much place for him. But if for some reason Biden has to drop out of the race, and what I find really fascinating, by the way, right now, is even 2 weeks ago, people were not willing to sort of talk about the issue of if Biden has to leave the race because of health reasons. But increasingly, I'm starting to see people talk about this and saying, if there is a health emergency, who becomes the alternative? I don't think Dean Phillips is that alternative. But nonetheless, I think that's one of the things we should be thinking about right now. And I want to bring it up here and say, for both of the candidates, I know we've been talking about the possibility of Donald Trump leading the race if there's a criminal conviction. But to say it delicately here, we're looking at two candidates who are in their upper 70s, early 80s. And again, I'm seeing stories, and tell me if you're seeing the same thing too. Increasingly, people are saying one or both of the candidates could face a health emergency in the next few months that could really change the dynamics or who the nominee might be.
Definitely a possibility. And I have to ask one more question here because Rob Olson, our reporter out in the field talking with voters here today, ran into a number of voters who are voting uncommitted. And that is one of the choices for Democrats on the Democratic ballot today, is to vote uncommitted. And there's a real possibility that uncommitted could get more votes than Dean Phillips.
Yes, it's happened. That happened before, and it could happen again here, is that there is a dissatisfaction within both parties in terms of Trump versus Biden. We know that about 60 or so percent of the American public is saying at this point they don't want to see this rematch. The most recent New York Times, that is Trump versus Biden, the most recent New York Times Siena poll is now also indicating that a majority of Democrats believe that Joe Biden is too old to run for president again. What we're getting at here, among a lot of constituencies, among progressives in the Democratic Party, there's an increased uneasiness about Biden. And the question becomes, is a vote for non-committed basically a message to tell Biden maybe to step aside? We don't know, but certainly there is that push out there in some circles. And does that become a louder and louder, I don't know, voice, if I can use that as a reference here? Possibly. And I think as we progress further and further into the next few weeks, and it's important point out here is that it's only just a matter of a few weeks, if nothing changes, that both Trump and Biden have enough delegates to get the nomination. Does the voice for non-committed or uncommitted get strong enough to slow that path down? We just don't know it.
Especially heading into the convention. All right.
Exactly.
Hamline University professor David Schultz, thank you. I always love these conversations, David. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
No problem. And I'll see everybody tonight, too.
All right. It sounds good. Amy, Kelsey, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we'll have David here on the set tonight at 8 o'clock. That is going to do it for us on Fox Local, but our coverage is just getting started. We'll be back for our 5 and 6 o'clock news on Fox Local and Fox 9. Polls close in Virginia and Vermont at 6 o'clock our time.
And then, yes, join us again at 8 exclusively right here on Fox Local. We'll have those live results from across the country. Right now, we're going to take you to Live Now, where live
Garvey in the 1 and 2 top spots here. And so that is definitely one to look at in California. Remember, Andy, this is the late Senator Dianne Feinstein's seat that she held for 30 plus years. California has not elected a Republican senator, I think, since the late 80s or early 90s. I'll have to check myself on that.